Welcome to the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast, episode number 203. And today, with Dr. Alex LeBeau, we'll sit down and do just a little intro on PFAS and just to kind of understand the hazards, where we find it, all that good stuff out there. But before that we get going, Alex, I'm not sure I even said your name right. And if you could do a little background about yourself, that would be awesome.
Sure, I appreciate that. Yep, you said it right, Alex LeBeau.
Okay.
I am a certified industrial hygienist. I'm also a toxicologist. I have my own company, Exposure Assessment Consulting, where I evaluate exposures to a number of different chemicals and biological organisms, assessing the risk and identifying ways to mitigate those risk drivers.
Mhm. Thank you, Alex. So I think when we get a little start and a little primer on PFAS, could you really go over the scientific name because I don't think I've ever said it right yet.
Sure, and this is going to probably lose a lot of people when they start hearing all these long scientific names. So when you hear PFAS, PFAS, we're talking about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And those are substances that are primarily composed of carbon and fluorine atoms.
Okay, so and then if I understand it right, it looks like we put like a lot of those in different the different formulas and configurations on things like non-stick pans. I think we also put it on I think I put it on my carpet and all of my couches because luckily
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not that messy, but my wife and kids and dog are really messy.
Sure. I mean, there's a long history, going back almost 100 years, for the use of PFAS. It's a great substance for if you don't want things to stick to something else. Like you said, you put it in your pots and pans. It allows those materials that you put in there to very slickly move off. It repels water. They use it in what's called surfactants to reduce friction, in certain processes. It's been found as of recently, I'll say, 10, 15 years ago, it was found in, I'll say, personal care products. They used to
Wow.
use PFAS that were in, you think of an old McDonald's or Wendy's hamburger wrapper. You don't want the food to stick to it. So what do you put in there? Something that's going to make it not stick. So, there's lots of things and lots of places that PFAS are found. You think of your carpets, as you mentioned, textiles, you think of your couch, even the inside of popcorn bags, getting into the industrial process. There's been found in some firefighting foams. There's a lot of applications and materials for use of PFAS in, I'll say, our lives for many years.
Wow. So it sounds as if it's really out there, very easy to find and prevalent. Could you go over the hazards of PFAS?
Well, that'll be the interesting part. So if you think about the hazards, there are lots of different, I'll say, potential hazards, and I think that thinking about the health impacts or health implications of the hazards uh, are 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 varying depending on the different type of PFAS. Now, PFAS is a large category. Again, when I say PFAS, PFAS, there's lots of different PFAS that are within subcategories under that. There's something called PFO, which is perfluorooctonic acid. There's another one, which is PFOS, perfluorooctonic sulfonic acid. So there's a lot of different, those are the main ones or big ones that people are maybe familiar with. Those are ones that have received a lot of attention and evaluation. Now, the hazards of those, there's been a lot of different attempts to evaluate them because they have been used in occupational settings for a number of years. That's probably the largest cohort to look at is the occupational assessment of those exposures. And then again, because it's been found in consumer products, getting down into, I'll say, the general population exposure to those. A lot of studies have been attempting to find out what the hazards are. And again, it depends on which PFAS you're talking about. For example, if you're talking about PFOA, there have been associations with high blood pressure, changes in birth weight, some immunological issues. If you're talking about PFOS, there may not be as many. So it all depends on which one of those individual ones you're talking about. Again, it makes it somewhat difficult to think of
Mhm.
PFAS as a class. So those are some of the potential hazards that we may be looking at from exposure to these substances.
Okay. Okay. Well, it sounds as if it's out there a lot more than what I first thought. So let's journey to the hypothetical world, and you're going to go do a PFAS assessment at a plant that's using it as part of the process, or they're just trying to understand any potential exposure. Is there a NIOSH standard yet for this, or is it just kind of more of in the discovery phase and finding stuff?
I'll say from a NIOSH standpoint, I think it's from a discovery phase, depending on the substance. So I've
Hmm.
had people approach me and say, I'm worried about occupational exposures to those. And I've had
Hmm.
conversations with the labs, said, what do you have methods for evaluation of PFAS contained in air? They say we're focused very much on water.
Hmm.
If some of your listeners may be familiar, in April of 2024, EPA came out with their final MCLs, maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. So a lot of laboratory efforts have been going into certifying and maximizing the efforts to detect PFAS in water. They have not been as concerned about PFAS in air. I've had some conversations and they say, well, that may be actually a concern that if you're interested in looking at it. So if I were to go to a site, I'd say, okay, first of all, let me understand what substances you're using, what you have historically used, because again, PFAS is in the stage of being phased out, but there's lots of historical records. Maybe it's something that was used at some point. Maybe there's some dust that's entrained somewhere that still contains some of those substances, or groundwater that they're using for wells, or dust suppression, or what have you. So I want to understand not only their current activities, but their historical as well, to understand what PFAS may have been on site.
Hmm. Okay, okay. So it sounds like right now they're really, really focused over on the water side. And the labs are getting these samples. The labs are saying it does or it does not meet the maximum. How do they how do they pull the PFAS out? Unless I'm not using the right terms.
But you mean from the water sample,
Yeah.
or
Oh, yes,
evaluating the
yes,
water sample?
yes.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't recall there are two EPA methods, and they're escaping me at the moment for
Hmm.
evaluation of drinking water, groundwater, and wastewater.
Hmm.
The methods that they are working. So this is where it gets somewhat interesting. So the methods, the MCLs for PFOA and PFOS are 4 parts per trillion.
Okay.
So there are some methods up until now that have not been even able to detect down to that level. So one of the
Right.
challenges is identifying and getting the reporting limit down so that they can actually accurately quantify that concentration. And again, those levels are based on a large risk assessments that EPA has performed on exposure to these substances. And they said, yes, this is where it needs to be. And some of the labs say that's within my error range. I can't even exactly quantify it
Right.
there,
Right.
which makes that a difficult effort.
Right. 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 So I don't know if maybe I'm asking you the wrong kind of question, but let's say that a city water system is coming back and it's over the MCL. Is there something that they can put in line to help to bring down that PFAS level?
Yeah, there are certain mechanisms that they can put in place to assist with um, a carbon filtration system that can
Mhm.
assist with that. So this is
Okay.
always what I like to bring up and make sure that people are understanding is, we're city municipalities may be putting these in the water systems, or even facilities that are identified as their own public water utility because they've served so many people with the industrial setting. They have to have these systems in place. There are always the opportunities for them to be capturing these substances, but there's also the opportunity for these additional filtrations to be causing other problems. So whenever I go into a
Mm,
facility and say, if you're intending to filter against this or do something to mitigate the exposure to this, what other secondary exposure may you be creating when you're trying to address this primary concern? So there's always the potential that something else pops up that you weren't expecting. So that's
right.
why I like to keep people their head on the swivel almost, to say, this is not the only thing you need to worry about. Let's look at a broad range of things to understand your system and then identify what may be coming through that was not before.
Right. So on a let's go away from the occupational setting and say, let's say for the sake of argument that I'm just kind of curious about my own personal PFAS level. Is there a way that I could get my own sample? Would I pee in a cup and give it to a lab? Or is there some other kind of mechanism that I would say maybe I didn't directly work in a area where with things with PFAS, but I definitely know that over the years I've drank a lot of coffee and ate a lot of pizza, and I'm sure that maybe there was like small traces, something possibly.
Sure, and I'm looking up now because that reminds me of a question. I think a while ago I saw something that was to the effect of, "Hey, if you are concerned about PFAS, speak with your physician when you go in for your annual physical, and they'll do blood tests to see if it's there."
Hmm.
And that leads to the question of, so there have been studies that have been done. There's something called NHANES, if you're not familiar with it.
Hmm.
It's a national health study that
Hmm.
CDC does every year, and they take samples from a number of different populations, subpopulations within the US, and they
Hmm.
identify what their concentrations are. Now, you can go into your physician's office and say, I'd like this test. And I think if you go on Quest and you type in PFAS, I think there's a test code for it.
Oh,
You can
okay. Hmm.
you can identify it. But what makes it, I'll say, difficult is, how do we interpret that result? What does that result actually mean? Do I have PFAS in my body right now? I'd say likely yes.
Right. Hmm.
What if I were to test it or determine it? What would the level that I'm getting out mean? What would the I'll say what would that biomarker mean in far as a risk level? That may be the more difficult thing to ascertain as we have data right now.
Right. And because we're just now starting to talk about it, it would be really hard to say that you got a baseline and now you've looked at it over the years. You could almost say, I've determined my baseline for me at age 58 is now this. And of course, I don't know how I got it, but I know from age 58 on, I could look at things.
Right. Yeah, you could have your time and point and say, listen, this is what it is right now. You can track it every year. You can track it every few years to understand what it is. And as the data gaps that we have right now are filled in more, it may
Hmm.
allow you to understand what your risks may be from that level, if you have any at all. Again, if you're talking about water levels that are 4 parts per trillion, you probably likely have some in you. But what does it mean?
Right.
So, having that information is useful. It's kind of like tracking your cholesterol over time. Okay, well, I can see it's going up and down, or I can see what it is at this point. So, thinking, how do I mitigate, the exposures to that, or change what it is? Do I identify that as something that I don't want in my body? What are the processes that I'm going to change to reduce it? And that testing probably tell you at least where you stand, as you said, right now.
Right. Uh, Now, for me, I'm just kind of throwing out these examples. I'm sure that I have some in me. I'm not really worried at this point, but I do have a couple friends who did some firefighting, and they've said, "Hey, we just saw where this is in foam," and I've just basically said, "Yep, I saw the same thing, but I really can't help you besides that, except to say, yeah, I saw exactly the same articles that you guys saw."
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it has been used in firefighting foam, AFFF, for a number of years. From what I understand, and seeing some information, this was stuff that was the military was interested in the 60s and 70s. It was, I think, one of the primary things that said we want to use this on our sites because of how effective it is at
Oh yeah,
extinguishing fires. And yeah, from my understanding, it's the ultimate goal, I think, of in a number of years recently, is to phase PFAS out of the manufacturing process. But that doesn't negate the fact that there's still some manufactured somewhere that may be used in training. A lot of this was used in training at some point. So what were those exposures? There's a lot of different studies out there evaluating that. So again, there, from the occupational standpoint, there are occupational exposures to this material that people should be concerned with. And again, if that's a scenario, that's something that you can have tested.
right. So when I was in the semiconductor industry, I want to say we signed a MOU, and not just us, but a lot of different companies with EPA and others that we would go back and engineer out the PFAS. I want to say 2005 or so. So they gave us like a couple of years to say, how do you get your process adjusted? How do you kind of move forward from this and all that? So I do know that there are a couple groups out there that have just independently kind of hooked up and said, well, we gotta do something. And I think they were trying to do something on the positive and proactive end as much as possible, because like all things, they want you to change because you want to change before they force a change on people
Right.
out there too.
And there is around that time frame is when there was maybe something you had discussion about is the want to shift from what they identified as long chain PFAS to short chain PFAS, thinking that there may be less of a concern. Now, I think the jury's still out on the hazards of the short chain as well, because going in there and rushing to change something and say, well, it's shorter, it must be better, may not always be the best thing.
Right,
So,
exactly.
how they made a replacement, but is the replacement safer, or what is I'll say the magnitude of the safety that was incorporated by using the shorter chains?
Right, 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 right. So you can't tell now, but I'm going to step up on a soapbox. So as a safety
Go ahead.
guy, I try to always tell folks that if you can avoid any exposure, do it. And of course, it doesn't even mean with PFAS, it means with any form of chemical solvent and all that stuff,
Right.
because there's a lot of times that the science and technology really hasn't caught up with it. We just don't have that exposure data. We just don't really know the long term. So just do everything you can. You certainly obviously can't live in a bubble and not have exposure, but do everything you can not to be exposed to things.
I say the same thing from an industrial hygiene standpoint is, hey, from a practical purpose, it's always good to reduce your exposures, from whatever it is, because you said there's something may pop up later on, but it's we understand, as you said, you can't live in a bubble. We understand the risks are now. We're incorporating those risks into our hygiene practices.
Right,
And
right.
if you don't have to do something, if you can engineer it out or get it out from an administrative standpoint, then do that. That's the best, I'll say, activity to ensure that you're working in an area that is as safe as can be.
Right, 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 right. So I did see a article and I started to read it and I put it down because I got distracted with something else. But it said that PFAS is going to be considered a forever chemical. Have they really kind of gone back and kind of quantified that, or they're just kind of keeping it and saying it's a for forever chemical?
Well, I think that they are using that as and they to say that it's a marketing point is not the best way to describe it, but
It
this
got
say,
me. It
listen,
works.
right, it does, it captures you.
Yeah.
So, and I've heard it many times is because these chemicals involve carbon and fluorine, they're the strongest bond that is out there. And because of that strength of that bond, that's why they anticipate the degradation in the environment is going to take a long time, hundreds of years. So that's why they call it the forever chemical. Now,
Hmm.
are there studies that have been done in accelerated conditions? I haven't reviewed and seen all those, but that's what the anticipation is. And again, it's very catchy to say forever chemical. Is it forever in the ground? Is it forever in your body? Is it forever anywhere? That's the question to ask is where is it going to be forever?
Right, right, right.
So that's a concern because these chemicals and substances are made to be heat tolerant.
Hmm.
You think about it when you're cooking. It's on a cooking surface. It's tolerant to the heat you're putting on there. So heat's not going to.
Right,
So what is going to eventually find out and it breaks down? It's a very catchy thing to get your attention. And I think that's an important thing to understand is if you're going to be concerned about the risk from it when you're hearing all these titles and things that grab your attention, you have to dive down deep into what does the risk actually translate into when you're talking about these forever chemicals.
right, 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 right. I think one of the things that a lot of safety guys have a hard time with is that we have a lot of chemicals to worry about. So it gets really hard to focus in on only one and really dive deep. So
I've heard that, and I've talked to people that say, we have so much other stuff going on, we don't have the time and attention to focus on this one particular problem. And I've said to them is like, you know what, I get it, I understand, we're all busy. If it's something where you need the help, go get somebody else outside that can focus on it for you. because
Exactly.
either you're going to worry about the risk or someone else is going to need to, because in the future, there may be a problem that pops up that you were not ready for or that you should have known about and didn't, and then it comes back to bite you.
Right, 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 right. Right, exactly, exactly. I think it's actually really, really neat that they were smart enough to do this. And I know that nobody could see the future 100 years back, but they were just so focused on how do we bring stuff to market? How do we make lives better out there? And so I don't think they made this with any really ill intent. It was awesome and great. But now we're just kind of starting to see the effects from it.
No, I don't think that. I mean, with a lot of things, I don't think there's any ill intent
Mhm.
with the manufacturing. So, but what it comes to now is what are the data actually telling us that the risks are from exposure to PFAS, PFAS,
Mhm.
and how can we manage those? Is there something from an individual chemical substance that we can talk about, or classification? Because again, if you think about these substances, if you go look at TSCA, Toxic
Mhm.
Substances Control Act, there's at least 500 PFAS that are listed in there. I've seen numbers that
Mhm.
from the overall total ranging from, a few thousand up to 12,000 different PFAS, different conformation or different structure of the constituents in there. So what where are we drilling down on those to identify the risks and what were you exposed to? Because if you look at the risk assessments that were done, it says this PFOA or PFOS and all the isomers, meaning again the structure of the atoms and chemicals within the chemicals. So, you know, are there data that are supportive of all of these, or are we making assumptions that we're going to have to fill in the future? Now, I think there's some proactive, as you said, being proactive now and getting ahead of it how we can. But I think there
Mhm.
still needs to be effort to fill in those data gaps how we can with good sound science on this.
Right, right, right. And with a family of 5,000, that makes it really hard. If you were just talking about one, that's going to be pretty darn simple. But when you look at all the different configurations, that's going to be hard, I think.
No, I agree. And in talking with friends that are chemists, again, there's there identified PFAS as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. The per, indicates that they're fully, completely full of fluorine. The poly means that they're not full and they could become fully fluorinated within the ground to create different PFAS once they're in the environment. So that I think
Ah,
adds to the challenge to identify where where the risks are, what substance you're actually being exposed to, because maybe environmental transformation turns it into a different form of the PFAS. So there's lots, when you address PFAS, PFAS, there's a big, I'll say, umbrella that has to be filled in. As you said, it's not when we're dealing one particular volatile chemical or chemical class. This is a big, huge potential thing that we're trying to manage under that one chemical, I'll say, classification. If you think of some control banding or something, it makes it difficult because where do you start and where do you end on that? Because there's may be differences in the risks under the categories of the PFAS.
right, 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 right. Yeah, well, this whole thing is really hard just from the sheer fact of if you have 5,000, like whoa, And I know that at this point it sounds as if they've come up with water and they said 4 parts per trillion. And is that for the whole family of PFAS, or that's just the ones that they've been able to really get a good sample on?
Those are just some of them, the
Just some, okay,
PFOA and the
right,
PFOS. Other ones have a 10 part per trillion
okay,
concentration on them. So if you go look up EPA, MCL, PFAS, you'll be able to find those levels for the MCL and what we call MCLG, maximum contaminant level goals.
hmm very good, very good. Alex, this has been a fantastic talk, but we are bumping up on time. Could you take a couple seconds and tell the folks where they could find you and reach out and talk to you more?
Sure. No, I appreciate that. I have a website, exposureconsulting.com. I also have a podcast called the Exposure Scientist Podcast, where we discuss exposures to chemicals and biological substances, the toxicological nature of it, the risk, and how we can mitigate those risks from exposure. So you can check me out there as well. And David, I appreciate you having me on the podcast today.
Anytime. And I also love to catch all your episodes too as well. It's really, really good, Alex.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. And with that, episode number 203 is complete with Dr. Alex LeBeau, and we talked about PFAS today. Everybody have a safe day.